Marco Polo was born in around 1254 to a wealthy Venetian merchant family. His father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo were successful jewel merchants who spent much of Marco's childhood in Asia. Marco's mother died when he was young, therefore, Marco had to be primarily raised by his extended family. As I mentioned, Niccolo and Maffeo were traders. They traded European goods for silk, furs, and spices, and primarily jewels across the Silk Road. They returned back to Marco Polo at 1269. When they returned, they told Marco Polo about all of their adventures, and specifically about Kublai Khan. Marco Polo became very interested, and around age 17, he had the opportunity to go around the world.
The Polos once more set out from Venice on their journey to the east. This time they took with them 17-year-old Marco Polo and two friars. The two friars hastily turned back after reaching a war zone, but the Polos carried on. They passed through Armenia, Persia, Afghanistan, over the Pamirs, and all along the Silk Road to China. Avoiding travel of the same route the Polos did 10 years ago, they made a wide swing to the north, first arriving at the Kingdom of Georgia. They then journeyed along the regions parallel to the western shores of the Caspian Sea. Reaching Tabriz, they made their way south to Hamaros on the Persian Gulf. They arrived at Badakhshan, where Marco Polo is bedridden from an illness and stays there for a year. Finally, the long journey was nearly over, and the great Khan had been told of their approach. He sent out a royal escort to bring the travelers to his presence. The Polos arrived to the original capital of Kublai Khan at Chengdu. By then, it had been 3.5 years since they left Venice, and they had traveled a total of 5,600 miles on the journey.
Because of his ability to speak 4 languages, Marco Polo became an essential asset to Kublai Khan of the Mongols and served highly in his court. The explorer turned administrator traveled to and oversaw places in Cathay such as China, Burma, and India. Marco was enchanted by Cambaluc, now Beijing, describing the palace as the greatest it ever was and the city as the most magnificent in the world. Polo was also shocked by the innovations such as the concept of paper money as currency, efficient communication involving foot runners and horses, coal instead of firewood, and the overall wealth that his citizens enjoyed. Marco enjoyed these luxuries as an official of the Privy Council in 1277, as well as being a tax inspector in Yanzhou for 3 years. However, Marco became paranoid that the next Khan of the Mongols would not treat him with as much generosity as Kublai Khan, and so he requested to travel back to Venice. Khan reluctantly agreed to let them return after they escorted Kugachin, a Mongol princess, to marry a Persian prince. 2 years later, after completing this mission, Polo returned home.
3 years after returning to Venice, Marco Polo assumed command of a Venetian ship in a war against Genoa. He was captured, and while being held in a Genovese prison, he met a fellow prisoner, a romance writer called Rustichello. When prompted, Polo dedicated his adventures to him. These writings, written in French, were titled Books of the Marvels of the World, but are better known in English as The Travels of Marco Polo.
During his time spent with the Mongols, Marco Polo acquired many of the traits and beliefs of the Mongolian culture. When he returned to Italy after his 16-year voyage, he was wearing Mongolian clothing and couldn't remember his native language. However, Marco Polo learned many new languages along the way. These languages were one of the many things introduced to the people of the West from Marco. Marco Polo was also fascinated by the customs of the Mongols. One custom Marco Polo learned about was the idea of paper money, which had been utilized in China for centuries before his arrival. Also, Marco Polo brought the idea of burning coal for heat to the Western people. Coal had been burnt in that area since the beginning of agriculture. However, no one learned about this because Marco Polo was the first person to come back and tell people about it. Marco Polo was a primary contributor of the cultural diffusion between the East and the West due to all the knowledge he had learned during his expeditions. During the time of his life and the near future after it, the tales told in Marco Polo's book was the most important account of the land outside of Europe.
Marco Polo had written a very famous book about his travels. In modern times, this book was often questioned and wondered if all of the things he was saying was factual. There was a lot of controversy about whether it was real or not and if the events actually took place, but then scientists from the 18th and 19th centuries found out a large amount of the information that he wrote in there was true, and he gained a new respect. Marco's book was recognized as the most important account of the world outside of Europe that was available at the time. It told stories of him traversing thousands of miles on horseback mostly, through deserts, mountains, fields. Marco's book became the most influential travelogue on the Silk Road ever written in a European language. It laid out the way for many arrivals of Westerners in the centuries to come. Of course, everyone and everything that he wrote in the book actually happened and was a thing at that time. What's interesting is that his book becomes great value to Chinese historians as it helps them better understand a lot of the important events of the 13th century, such as the siege of, excuse me if I say this wrong, Xiangyang and the massacre of Changzhou, and the attempted conquest of Japan. A lot of the information that he wrote in his book was incorporated into later maps, such as the Catalan World Map of 1375. Like I said, his book inspired many travelers, such as Columbus and Henry the Navigator. In the book, he set his own system of navigation, which is measuring distance by days. Later, this was found out to be extremely accurate. His book was so accurate that today, topographers have called his work the precursor of scientific geography.